Elvis was a very special person. He never turned no one down that was in need. He was a loving and caring person for everyone that he came in contact with, and most everyone loved him.
She lived inside Graceland for decades, watching much of Elvis Presley's adult life unfold around her. When the world learned he had died, she was there. And when Graceland opened its doors to tourists, she stayed, hidden just off the kitchen, for 11 more years. Her name was Delta Biggs, and by the time she died in 1993, she was the last family member still calling Graceland home. What she saw was never meant for the public. Until now, who was Aunt Delta? Before she became a footnote in Elvis Presley's story, Delta Mae Presley was just Vernon Presley's sister. That makes her Elvis's aunt, and to the family, she was never Delta Biggs, mysterious Graceland recluse. She was simply Aunt Delta. She married a man named Pat Biggs, and for years she lived a quiet, ordinary life, largely outside the spotlight that had swallowed her nephew whole. But grief has a way of redrawing the map of a person's life. When Pat Biggs died, Delta found herself without a husband, without children, and without much reason to stay where she was. So she did what any Presley would do when the walls closed in. She went home, to Graceland, that it's worth sitting with how quiet that decision actually was. There was no press release, no announcement, no headline calling it a turning point in Presley family history. It was just a widow moving in with relatives, the same way families have supported each other for generations. Except this particular family happened to include the single most famous entertainer alive. Delta moved into the mansion in 1967, joining a household that already included Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae. This was not yet the Graceland of gift shops and guided tours. This was still just a house. A big, strange, beautiful house where a family was trying to hold itself together, while one of its members turned into the most famous man on the planet. Think about what that actually meant, day to day. This wasn't a distant relative visiting for the holidays. Delta was living under the same roof as Elvis Presley during the height of Beatlemania, during his Hollywood movie years, during his comeback, and eventually during the Las Vegas era that defined the last stretch of his life. She wasn't reading about his career in magazines. She was watching it happen from the next room. Elvis was generous to the people who stayed close to him, and Delta was one of them. This wasn't a rumor or an exaggeration cooked up after his death. It's one of the most consistently repeated facts about Elvis from nearly everyone who actually knew him. He took care of the people around him. He kept family close. He housed relatives who needed a place to land, and he built an entire wing of his life around loyalty. Delta had a roof, she had family, and she had a front row seat to a life that most people could only dream about from the outside. But a mansion full of family members isn't automatically a peaceful place. The very thing that made Graceland special, the fact that it housed a global superstar, also made it a pressure cooker. Every person who lived there absorbed some version of the chaos that came with being related to the most famous man in the world. The fans outside the gates never stopped. The demands on Elvis's time never stopped. And the people closest to him, Delta included, lived inside that pressure whether they asked for it or not. So what happens when the dream starts to crack? What does it look like when the walls of a mansion start to feel less like a shelter and more like a cage? Life inside the walls. To understand what Delta witnessed, you have to understand what Graceland actually was in those years. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't a tourist attraction. It was a home occupied by a family trying to function under the weight of global fame. Elvis bought the estate in 1957, and he didn't buy it just for himself. He bought it for his parents, for his grandmother, and eventually for the extended family members who would come to live under its roof over the following decades. That included Aunt Delta. Inside those walls, the picture that emerges from people who actually lived there is not a simple one. It is not Elvis, the untouchable icon. It is something closer to a portrait of a man split in two. On one side, there was Elvis the family man, the one who made sure his relatives were housed, fed, and cared for, the one capable of real warmth toward the people who had known him before he was famous. On the other side, there was a man increasingly boxed in by his own legend, dealing with the isolation, the scrutiny, and the exhausting machinery of being Elvis Presley full-time. Delta lived close enough to see both sides. She wasn't a fan standing outside the gates. She was family, sharing meals, sharing space, sharing the ordinary rhythms of a household that happened to have a rock and roll king wandering through it. She saw the version of Elvis that never made it into a magazine spread, the one who was tired or short-tempered or simply human on an ordinary Tuesday, alongside the version who could still light up a room the moment he walked into it. That duality is really the heart of what makes Graceland's family history so compelling. It wasn't a house full of scandal. It was a house full of contrast. Warmth and pressure, generosity and exhaustion, family closeness and creeping isolation, all under the same roof, sometimes in the same afternoon. It's the kind of household dynamic plenty of families would recognize on some smaller scale, except here it was magnified by fame, by money, and by a level of public attention that most people never have to factor into their family dinners. And then on August 16, 1977, the family side of that story ended abruptly. Elvis died at Graceland at the age of 42. It's one of the most widely documented facts in modern music history, confirmed by medical examiners, reported around the world within hours, and never seriously disputed by anyone with actual credibility. The king was gone, and the house he built for his family would never be just a family home again. What do you do when the person who built your entire world around him is suddenly gone? What happens to a family home once the man who made it famous is dead? The house that kept emptying out Elvis's death didn't empty Graceland all at once. It emptied it slowly, one loss at a time, and Delta watched almost all of it happen. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, died 2 years after his son. Then Minnie Mae, the grandmother who had lived alongside Delta for years, passed away in 1980. One by one, the people who had filled that house with noise and family history were gone. The bedrooms emptied. The dinner table got quieter. The mansion that had once buzzed with Presley family life started to feel more like an echo of itself. That left Aunt Delta, alone in a mansion built for a legend, holding down a home that increasingly felt like it belonged more to the world than to her family. Every other person who had once shared that roof with her was gone, and yet she stayed in the same rooms, walking the same halls, as the entire estate slowly transformed around her into something else entirely. In 1982, Priscilla Presley made the decision to open Graceland to the public. It was a business decision, a preservation decision, and in many ways, an inevitable one. Elvis Presley's home was too significant, both culturally and financially, to sit empty and decaying while the estate figured out what to do with it. On opening day, more than 3,000 fans lined up to walk through the doors of a home that had, until recently, been entirely private. But opening Graceland to the public also meant something strange and deeply personal for the one family member who still lived there. Delta's actual home, her bedroom, her kitchen, her daily life, was about to become a public attraction, and she wasn't leaving. So an arrangement was made. Delta kept her bedroom, tucked off the kitchen, away from the path the tourists would walk. That room and the kitchen around it stayed off limits to visitors for years, carved out specifically so she could keep living the way she always had, undisturbed, even as thousands of strangers moved through the rest of the house every single day. Which raises the question every visitor probably wondered without knowing it. While thousands of strangers walked through the living room and the jungle room every single day, snapping photos and soaking in the legend, what was happening just a few feet away, behind a door they weren't allowed to open? The woman behind the door. This is where Delta Big stops being a footnote and starts becoming genuinely fascinating. By day, Graceland ran like clockwork. Tour groups moved through the mansion on a schedule, guided past the white staircase, the dining room, the piano room, all curated for maximum reverence. And somewhere behind a closed door near the kitchen, an older woman with a small dog lived her actual unglamorous life, mere feet from the spectacle. According to accounts shared by the family, including Elvis's daughter Lisa Marie Presley, Delta had a sharp, unfiltered sense of humor about the whole situation. She reportedly wasn't always thrilled to be treated like a museum exhibit's neighbor, and when curious tourists occasionally spotted her walking her dog and asked if she was Aunt Delta, she would sometimes brush them off entirely, telling them Delta had died the night before. It's a kind of story that has circulated within family retellings for years, less a headline-grabbing scandal, and more a glimpse of a woman who had grown tired of being a living exhibit in her own home, that there's something almost funny about that image once you sit with it. Somewhere in America's most visited private residence, a woman in her 60s was walking a dog past strangers who treated her like part of the attraction, and her response was to gently mess with them rather than play along. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about who Delta actually was underneath the last resident of Graceland label. Sharp, a little stubborn, and not particularly interested in performing for an audience. At night, once the last tour group filed out and the doors were locked, something interesting happened. Delta would come out of her room and have the run of the entire mansion to herself. According to Graceland's own archivist, she would sometimes rearrange elements of the house during those quiet hours, small acts of ownership over a space that legally belonged to an estate, but that had once simply been hers. Reportedly, this even factored into a conversation with Graceland's chief executive about whether the home's decor from Elvis's final years should stay exactly as it was when he died, a small but telling reminder that Delta wasn't just living in a museum piece. She still saw it as a home worth having an opinion about. Think about that for a second. During the day, Graceland was a shrine to a dead icon, roped off, narrated, and photographed by thousands of strangers. At night, it was still, quietly, somebody's home, with somebody still deciding where the furniture should go. So which version of Graceland was the real one? The polished museum thousands of strangers walked through every afternoon, or the after-hours house that only one woman still knew how to live in?